Hi everybody, I hope you're all doing really well. So today I am back to talk about The Temple of Fortuna by Elodie Harper, which is the third and final book in the Wolf Den Trilogy. That trilogy, of course, including The Wolf Den, The House of the Golden Door, and now The Temple of Fortuna, which was published November of 2023. I have really loved reading this series, and in short, my conclusion to this is that the books just get better with every installment. So if you are already a fan of this series and want to know, is this book worth giving a read, then my answer is absolutely yes. This was my favourite of the series. The series has gone out with a bang in more ways than one. Sorry, I couldn't resist putting that joke in there. But I will find it kind of hard to talk about the plot of this third book without having any allusions to spoilers at all from the first two books. And so I'm going to try and summarise the series as best as I can now in a mostly spoiler-free way. I'll talk about The Wolf Den from the perspective of somebody who's never read The Wolf Den, talk about The House of the Golden Door briefly as though you have read The Wolf Den, and then I will move on to The Temple of Fortuna, talking about it as if you have read the previous two books. So I will just note, when I'm talking about The Temple of Fortuna, I am going to talk about one particular plot point, which I guess is technically a spoiler, but it's something that should be fairly obvious to anybody who has read the previous two books, or even has any sort of notion about the plot of The Wolf Den and where it is based. So The Wolf Den is set in 74 AD in Pompeii and follows the character of Amara. Amara was originally from Greece, from a fairly respectable, well-to-do family. Her father was a doctor and he taught her many of the skills of his trade. However, despite this fairly happy childhood, upon the death of her father, her mother ended up selling her into slavery, being unable to pay debts of the family any other way. And so we meet Amara at the beginning of The Wolf Den as an enslaved sex worker, forced into working at one of Pompeii's brothels, the name of this brothel being The Wolf Den, being owned by Felix, who is the recurring antagonist of the series. Felix is cunning, manipulative, malicious, and represents the epitome of danger to Amara. Throughout the series, but particularly in this first book, we see Amara's relationships to the other women who work at the brothel, the camaraderie they share and the different ways that they have of coping with their situation, whether it is Britannica, whose instinct is always to fight back, whether it is Victoria, who very much tries to play within the system. A quote that comes to mind from House of the Dragon, of all things, is Rhaenys Targaryen's line, "You desire not to be free, but to make a window in the wall of your prison," or to do as Amara does, which is to try and attain her freedom by any means possible, using whatever skill she has at her disposal. And thankfully for Amara, she does have quite a few skills. Not only is Amara very intelligent and learned, having learned a lot about medicine from her father, she's also gifted with a beautiful singing and speaking voice, and she's also very good at reading other people, being able to ingratiate herself within company and using subtle manipulation tactics in order to win people over. And she uses all of these talents combined to make herself indispensable to Felix and also make her more desirable to any wealthy patrons who end up entering the Wolf Den, with the goal being to demonstrate that she is somebody that can be not just of physical use but intellectual use. While the book is definitely slower paced, I feel like Elodie Harper really uses the pace to build these characters and their relationships, to create figures who feel very real and variously morally grey, and also to build up this atmosphere, this seedier underbelly of Pompeii. And what I will say is that while what we witness happening to these women is shocking and disturbing, it's not gratuitous. Elodie Harper never forgets that the women who are at the Wolf Den are not there by choice. She does not sensationalise or glamorise any of the trauma that they suffer. Also of note is how Elodie Harper's writing is infused with a deep level of research. She begins every chapter with a quotation from primary sources from Pompeii, and yet it never gets bogged down with that kind of historical detail. It flows very naturally, detail only being commented upon as it becomes relevant to what the characters are actually doing or saying. So that is the end of the discussion of The Wolf Den, so please do disappear if you haven't read The Wolf Den, as I'm going to be moving on to The House of the Golden Door. Okay? Good. The House of the Golden Door picks up with Amara having achieved her objective of becoming free. But we know from the last book that her freedom came at a cost, and that despite being physically removed from the Wolf Den, mentally she is still very much there. Her past is always just a step behind her, whether it is the fact that many of the social elite of Pompeii ignore her or downright reject her due to knowing her past, whether it is her desperation to try and free the other women in the Wolf Den and extract them from the clutches of Felix, or with the knowledge that her freedom is conditional, based on the whims of the man who freed her, Rufus, and one wrong move may see her back as a slave. For me, this was an even better book from the first, as we got to see these different characters' dynamics shift and change, especially considering that Amara is going from being a slave to being a slave owner, and she has this moral dilemma, and we witness how her behaviour changes when suddenly she is in a position of power over other people, and how tempting it is to become that which you once hated. We also get a much wider scope of Pompeii, whereas previously Amara's travel was restricted very much to, as I say, the underbelly of Pompeii, and she never never had access to the wealthier areas. Now she has access to those wealthy areas, but it's kind of frowned upon for her to go back to her old haunts, not seen as respectable. So she is restricted, but in a different setting. But we also get more of a sense of the scope of the Roman Empire as a whole, with Amara travelling to different places. By the end of the House of the Golden Door, the stakes are much higher for Amara. There's a real emotional journey that she's been going through, and she's in a position not only where she's looking out for herself, but now she has to think about other people as well. She is now personally responsible for others, and as a result has to be even more careful with how she acts. And now moving on to the Temple of Fortuna. The Temple of Fortuna begins with Amara in Rome in 79 AD, so we have passed a couple of years from the end of the House of the Golden Door, where we see Amara living as concubine to her patron Demetrius, and she's been thrown into the political landscape of the Roman Empire, with her lover being an imperial advisor. At the beginning, we see her witnessing the funeral of the recently deceased Vespasian and the succession of the new emperor Titus. However, we also see Amara witnessing Berenice, Queen of Judea, being dismissed from court, the Emperor Titus having pressure put on him by his advisors to let her go. And so we have repeated once again that being a man's mistress, no matter what social station you are at, is tenuous. After a particularly brutal incident occurs in Rome, the aftermath of which puts Amara potentially in danger, Demetrius has Amara temporarily return to Pompeii, and it is returning to her old home and her old friends that forces Amara to really confront the emotional weight of the choices that she made in the previous books. We see a continuation of a theme from the House of the Golden Door, in which Amara has been free for so long that she has started to treat slaves like they don't matter, whether that is not knowing their names, not bothering to learn their names, or even being physically violent with them in order to assert her dominance. Though these instances are few and far between, and she does quickly realise what she's done, it does still happen and is still shocking. With the position and the power to assert dominance over others, there are times where she does take it. And throughout the course, particularly of the first half of this book, while she physically is in the most luxury, comfort and security that she has ever been in, or at least the closest to it, yet in many ways, particularly mentally, she still isn't free. Once and for all, this book challenges her with the question which has been haunting her throughout the whole series, which is, what will Amara choose? Safety or love? Will she side with pragmatism or emotion, head or heart? And when what is at stake is control over not just your life, but the lives of others, how much is it really a choice? In the midst of all of this questioning, however, this book offers a sharp reminder that there is only so much that human will alone can do, and that the natural world will come to disrupt everything. Okay, so let's be very, very honest with ourselves. Regardless of whether or not this would technically be considered a spoiler, if you have been following along to this series up to this point, you will have suspected where this final book is going. From reading the first book, which takes place in 74 AD, I would have been shocked if you told me that this final book of the series did not include the eruption of Vesuvius. And certainly upon learning that this book takes place in autumn of 79 AD, there is no chance that you can tell me that this book would not have that included. It's also in the blurb, so, it's not a spoiler. Let's be very clear. Vesuvius and the eruption does play a part of this book. So I want no one coming to me saying that that's a spoiler, because it's not. And oh boy. I feel like if there's anything that people could criticise this book for, it's that definitely the first half of this book is quite slow-paced, much in the way that The Wolf Den was very slow-paced. It isn't always clear for the first half of this book what the overall narrative thread is going to be, what the plot is going to be. But I think what becomes clear as you move into the Vesuvius chapters is that this first half is really this cast of characters' swan song. For many of these characters, it is their last hurrah, the last chance for a lot of these characters that we have grown to care and love, having a chance to kind of take a final bow before we know that we are inevitably going to lose some of them. And I will just say, Elodie Harper really lets them shine. Not always because they're good people, sometimes they are shining in their awfulness. But I think most characters that you would think of through the series get a chance in the first half to interact with Amara in some way. And it's only upon the second half of the book that you really come to appreciate that. And I can understand if on a first read you're reading it and thinking, what's going to happen next? Because it is really just as the plot, as these characters would see it, their plans at least, start to get into gear, that the volcano starts to make itself known, and suddenly all of these grand plans get thrown out the window. And as for the Vesuvius chapters themselves, well, I'm not going to lie to you, I read the Vesuvius chapters within one sitting because they were so compulsive, just so horrifying, so gutting, seeing these characters being pushed to their breaking points. We've seen many of these characters in crisis modes before, but nothing so unrelenting and unreasonable as nature. It was so vivid and descriptive, you felt like you were being suffocated. You, as the reader, feel as helpless as the characters do, but at least you have hindsight. But no matter how much you may will a character to make a different decision, you can't really do anything. It was like watching a disaster movie, but like a good disaster movie. I just felt so much dread. And considering that I hadn't really seen Elodie Harper write something like that before, I was really pleasantly surprised. I didn't know how she was going to pull it off. I even thought for a moment that Amara might not even get to witness Vesuvius. Maybe she'd get pulled out of Pompeii just in time. But no, we get to experience it in all its glory. And it is really wonderfully told. And these Vesuvius chapters really made me think of The Essex Dogs by Dan Jones, and a recurring theme that goes throughout that book, which is how in times of crises, social rank and divisions end up falling down because everybody recognises each other's humanity, and so those class distinctions don't matter. Well, in the Temple of Fortuna, I suppose it is very, very different when you've got two different classes of people, one being seen as the elite and the others being second-class citizens, not even really being considered people at all. Because you see in times of crisis here, with the eruption of Vesuvius, how those distinctions still remain intact. When the distinction is between slave, somebody who has no control and ownership of their life, and freeman, you see the elite especially really enforcing that divide because they already see slaves as not deserving of their own lives. And it is brutal. And you see Amara and the other characters within this book and how this crisis really forces their hand in making these big decisions. I don't want to say too much more. I don't want to spoil things even more than I probably already have, but it was a really fantastic conclusion. And right up until the last pages, I was gasping at different things that Elodie Harper did. And honestly, by the time I got to the last page, I was like, no, you can't tell me that's the end, because I just want even more of this. So I think overall a very, very successful series in my mind, and I'm definitely reading anything else that she writes. So there we go, those are all of my very scattered thoughts about the Wolf Den Trilogy, and particularly the Temple of Fortuna. Please do let me know if you've read this series, what you thought. I would love to hear from you. I hope you're having a fantastic, fantastic day, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks. Bye.